Now available in paperback and e-readers, Isis, Samurai Goddess. The goddess next door takes on kung fu killers in this action-packed martial arts Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Samurai Goddess in paperback and e-readers today. Denial is not just a river in Egypt, it is a state of mind for many in the comic book industry. And because many in the comic book industry are in denial, they can't acknowledge the real problems that are creating a crisis in the comic book industry that could ultimately lead to its collapse. Now, I got a comment from such an individual, and they decided to say that I was trolling and that the state of the industry is perfectly fine because people go out here and buy comic books for Christmas. But all I have to do is take a look at the Comicron.com numbers, and they show me how dire the state of the industry is. Now, others understand this, such as Diversity in Comics, Douglas Ernst, Just Some Guy, Mim Headroom, and many others. And when they look at the numbers for the state of Marvel, DC, and the overall comic book industry, they see how abysmal the numbers are. And when I look at those numbers for ordered comics, they are they make you shake your head because they're just so sad. I mean, iconic characters like Spider-Man, who used to pull at least 500,000 sales back in the 1980s, are now barely doing 40,000 orders. The X-Men, who used to do over a million a month at Marvel in sales back in the late 1980s when I used to buy comic books, are now barely getting 40,000 orders. Superman, who was an icon in the 1950s and used to do 5 million sales a month, and lower tier titles like Lois Lane and Superboy, which used to do 5 million sales a month, are now down to 40,000 orders. And that's really sad when you think about how much these comics have dropped off. They've literally, many of them have dropped off 90% when you compare them to their peak numbers back in the 80s and even the 50s when you compare to Superman. Those numbers are pathetic even when you compare them to trade paperback and romance novels. Romance novels are doing better than comic books because if you look at the New York Times bestseller list or the romance novel list, they pull higher sales than many of these A-list comic book characters in publishing. And this is what's really sad about the comic fan, is that they are in so deep denial. They think that that Marvel is going and DC are going to go on forever, and that the comic book industry is going to go on forever because they posted a certain amount of sales, but this is just a small amount of money in proportion to what these properties make in the movies, merchandising, and licensing. That's where they're making billions more than in publishing. And the numbers they're making in publishing, again, they are abysmal when you really think about them and start really comparing them to other forms of media. And when you start comparing them to other forms of media, that's where you start to see how dire the situation is. Now, there are people in the comic book industry who are now starting to see how bad the situation is, and one of them was the orchestrator of the New 52, DC's Dan Dido. And back at San Diego Comic-Con, he acknowledged how bad the problem is, and he and Jim Lee both said that they need to do something to save the industry. Now, their plans with this DC rebirth were to try to find a way to get sales back up after the disastrous New 52 alienated so many comic fans and led to so many people walking away from the DC brand. So now they want to try to right the ship with Rebirth, but Rebirth just isn't strong enough to revive interest in the damaged DC brand. Too many people have been alienated, and most people will pretty much walk away once they see that there's no payoff in the form of the classic DC universe returning. That's what people have been waiting for, and that's what people want to see. And they want to see if this doomsday clock leads up to the return of the classic DC universe. And if Geoff Johns does not pay off, that's the nail in the coffin for DC Comics. Now, on the Marvel side, Marvel has done extensive damage with their attempt to create this diversity, which many are calling SJW Marvel. And they decided, just as their characters were at the height of their popularity in films, they were going to replace all of their core characters like Tony Stark, Iron Man, Steve Rogers Captain America, Peter Parker Spider-Man, and Odin's son Thor, with minorities in those roles in the books. And most people stopped buying those books, and that led to a precipitous drop over the last 2 years to the point where Marvel lost literally 90% of all of its sales. And all of this damage has devastated the local comic shop, and it's devastated it to the point where we literally had 50 comic book stores go out of business just this year. And the only place most people buy their comics these days is at a comic shop. So if the two big comic publishers are struggling to sell comics, then we have a serious problem. A serious problem, so serious that at New York Comic Con, people came to Marvel executives, comic shop owners came to Marvel executives and demanded that they stop pushing these SJW Marvel comics because they were driving them out of business, because they could not sell most of these comics. When it came down to these SJW comics, most of them have been rotting on the shelves, 20, 30 thick stacks, and these guys are suffering because of it. Because if the comic shop can't sell comics, then they lose a good chunk of their business. And a lot of comic shops have been suffering over the last 8 years into this over 20-year comic slump due to publishers making really bad business decisions. Over at DC, that New 52 has literally alienated so many DC fans that comic shops are struggling with stacks and stacks of non-returnable DC books. And over at Marvel, the SJW books are stacking up to the point where they're stuck again with more non-returnable merchandise. Because when it comes down to comics, comic shops order comics, but if they can't sell them, then they wind up stuck with them, because comics, unlike romance novels and unlike trade paperbacks, are non-returnable. So that shop has to sit there and eat the cost of all those books, and as they languish in quarter bins and 50-cent bins and dollar boxes, this shop is taking a big loss, and the shop owner is not able to pay their rent or feed themselves because they rely on those comic shop sales, on those comic book sales, in order to make their living. And when publishers publish really bad comics, that prevents that comic shop owner from making a living. And in some places in the country, things have gotten so bad that the only comic shop for 50 or 100 miles is forced to go out of business, and that really hurts the comic book industry long term. Nobody really connects the dots regarding comic books in the comic book fandom, and that's really troubling, because I can connect the dots as a guy who has publishing experience, and I can see the devastating damage that DC and Marvel's late-era business decisions have done to the overall market. Because the decisions that DC made in 2011 to end its DC universe, and even before that, when they launched stories like Identity Crisis and Infinite Crisis and alienated comic fans, have led to people stop buying DC comics, and Marvel's campaign to promote this diversity campaign that went wrong alienated Marvel fans. And all of that has led to this comic book industry in the worst state that it's in, to the point where you see comics that they can't give away, even if they gave them to hospitals or anything, because people just don't like the stories, because the stories are just so badly written, the art is so uninspired, and the product is of the poorest quality in the history of the medium. Most of these comics that are being produced these days are of such poor quality that you literally can't even give them to a kid, and the best you can do with them is use them to line a bird cage or even a cat's litter box. That's how bad these comic books are. And you have many of these fans sitting there in denial, believing everything is going great when everything is not going great. Because if the publishers can't sell comics, then they don't have a source to adapt material for your movies or your television shows, because that well is starting to run dry, because eventually you reach a point where if you don't have stories to adapt, then you wind up with no material for your movies or your television shows. But again, some of these guys are in such denial, they cannot connect the dots and see how everything lines up and how everything has to work together to synergize in order for everything to flow smoothly. In order for there to be superhero movies, there have to be comic books. And if there are no quality comic books being produced, then you're not going to get superhero movies. You're not going to get characters who become popular enough to become licensed or merchandised. And eventually, the whole thing starts to completely collapse. And without the quality comics, you don't have the foundation for the licensing, for the merchandising, for the action figures, for the video games, for the movies. So we desperately need to fix the comic book industry. And the comic book industry has been in a sad state of affairs for over 25 years because people refuse to acknowledge the problem comprehensively. You have Dan Dido and Jim Lee saying that they want to do something, but when we look at Rebirth, we really don't see them doing anything to be serious about giving the customers what they want. And over at Marvel, we have a company so directionless that no one really understands these characters to give people the type of quality product that will allow readers to access these characters in the 21st century. So I look at the big two and there's no vision. And I look at many of the smaller companies like Archie and the Indies, and they also are having problems as well because I look at their numbers. I look at the Archie reboot numbers, and they're abysmal as well. And I also look at several of the other indie numbers, and they're really abysmal. I mean, if these books are getting 5,000 orders, that means only 2,500 are sold. If the book is getting 20,000 orders, that means only 10,000 are sold. And again, in a country of 300 million people, that's barely a drop in the bucket. When you look at the publishing industry, what they consider a success in trade publishing is a book that does at least 100,000 sales or 50,000 sales, and a bestseller is something that does over 1 million sales. And when you look at comics and you look at the order numbers and you see that the top book is only doing 100,000 orders, that means it's barely doing 50,000 sales. And if that's the state of the comic book industry, then the comic book industry is in serious trouble overall. And most of these comic fans need to understand how bad the situation is, because if these companies can't get it together and get those people off the sidelines to start buying comics again, we're not going to have a comic book industry in the future for the next generation of comic book readers. All the actions we take today are going to affect tomorrow, and most comic fans don't understand that actions need to be taken now in order to save these characters for people of the next generation. If you'd like to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to try some of my SJS Direct publications, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.